Thanks for joining us for part 2 of today's program. And of course, thank you to our corporate partner, KPMG. We're going to talk about which technologies are worth the long-term investment for companies with a fantastic panel. Please welcome our moderator, senior writer, and Fortune Brainstorm Tech co-chair, Aaron Pressman. A few quick reminders if you're just joining us for this session. Today's gathering is on the record, and it will be covered by Fortune journalists. Again, we'd love to have audience questions, so you can just enter those in the chat function. I'll take a look and I'll try to get them into discussion. We will make sure that Aaron sees them, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can, so please don't hold back. The discussions are much richer when you all chime in and ask questions, so please do. Over to you, Aaron.
Thanks, Andrew. We've got a diverse set of people here today, a great group, so let's dig in. Let's welcome Emily Heath, who is the Chief Trust and Security Officer at DocuSign. Miriam Hernandez-Kakol is the Senior Partner and Global Head of the Management Consulting Practice at KPMG. Jesse Levinson is the Co-Founder and Chief Technology Officer at Zoox, the self-driving car company. Jennifer Lopez is Vice President for Product Development and Head of the Innovation Lab at Capital One. And John Roese is Global Chief Technology Officer of Products and Operations at Dell Technologies. Welcome, everybody. I do want to talk about a lot of the technologies we've been talking about for a while in tech, you know, the 5G and the AI and machine learning. But I thought, you know, given that it is the beginning of 2021, it might be nice to go around the panel and start off, talk a little bit about what we've learned during the pandemic about innovation and product design and what we might need and what's changed a little bit. Emily, why don't you kick it off? How has the year of the pandemic affected life and product design over at DocuSign?
Yeah, well, thank you, Aaron, and hi, everybody, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. I really have been looking forward to this panel. So yeah, much like probably many of your organizations, we went through the pandemic beginnings to where we stand today. Much like everybody else. Thankfully, we were in a situation where we already had a lot of the technology already. We already had a pretty established remote workforce. So things like Zoom and Slack were kind of mainstay for us, which was good. But the most interesting part of how we switched into the dynamics of the pandemic for me were how DocuSign had to really pivot to adjust to help our customers, because here we were in a world of all of a sudden pen and paper is just not a thing that can be used. And you know, the era of digital signatures has been around for a long time, but when you were thinking about, you had state departments who needed to move PPE around, you had schools that needed online registrations, you had insurance companies and people applying for unemployment and those kinds of things. So it was actually really neat to be a part of the journey of helping our customers. We were absolutely in the trenches, figuring it all out in real time with them. And I think what it really taught us was, you know what, we are all resilient no matter what. We got through this phase so far as we did, and we can do so much more than we anticipated. I think we've proven to ourselves that we're resilient, but that having that kind of customer contact and being in the trenches with customers during that time was really, really eye-opening. And kudos to our customer support and our product people who were really up morning, noon, and night trying to make sure we were mobilizing real life as it was unfolding right in front of us. So that was really fascinating.
Jesse, tell us at Zoox, how has the last year been and how has it changed your process?
Well, it's certainly been an adventure for us. We ended up getting acquired by Amazon last year, sort of in the middle of everything. Fortunately, able to completely continue on our full and original mission, and we're an independent subsidiary. So it's a really nice setup for us, but you know, the timing was certainly stressful. Things started going crazy right as we were kind of doing our fundraising. And we had to actually stop doing our driving. You know, we have a large fleet of level 3 test vehicles, and we had to stop doing that. We even had to stop building our own robo-taxis that we revealed at the end of last year. We had to completely pause the build. So it was a very difficult time for the company. But again, you know, in this theme of resiliency that everybody keeps talking about, you know, we found a way to keep going. We found a way to use more offline tools and simulation to keep making progress. on the software. We found a way to safely resume some of our vehicle builds at a lower cadence with, a very much smaller number of people in the manufacturing facilities, and did that safely. And we still managed to reveal our vehicle publicly, driving autonomously in San Francisco by the end of last year. So we pulled it off, but it was not easy, and it required tremendous effort and creativity from the entire team.
That robo-taxi looks really cool. We'll put a pin in that and come back to that, because I want to talk about that more. But Miriam, as a consultant, I'm sure you're used to helping other people rearrange their workflows. But what happened to KPMG as you dealt with the pandemic?
Well, I was thinking, Aaron, as Emily and Jesse were answering, that we had sort of two experiences, right? We had the experience for our own workforce. And as consultants, auditors, tax advisors, we're used to being side by side with our clients. In fact, we always say that's what gives us the ability to really deliver value, is understanding their business. Where we had solid long-term relationships, I think it was a smooth transition. I think where it's been a little bit tougher in order to figure out what the right relationship operating model is with our newer clients, or as we were closing deals, right, as pandemic hit. And then there was our employee base, people who are used to getting on airplanes and going and suddenly grounded at home. So there was a lot of wellness and just how do you continue to have that collaborative spirit that serves our clients. But, we did pretty well. We did pretty well in terms of being able to deliver on our commitments to clients, to close new business. We were actually astounded by, especially in our digital environments, right, where we sell things like our powered solutions, taking applications to the cloud, or where we sell digital transformation work. Those things just continued to grow. For our clients, I think being able to bring them innovative ways that they could suddenly, it wasn't so much the remote working. I think everyone got that under their belt fairly quickly. But there was things around service delivery models, especially for our clients that have a delivery model that's spread globally, and sort of the geopolitical challenge to what happens if India closes down, what happens if we don't get enough support in the Philippines, what happens in China. So that whole sort of service delivery model was a very big focus for us early on in the pandemic. I would say now it's shifted almost wholeheartedly to how do we help people accelerate their digital journeys and their cloud transformations. It's amazing when you look at all the research. It's absolutely true, because we're experiencing it every day. And everyone here is experiencing it every day. We've done in 9 months probably what some companies wouldn't have done in 2 or 3 years.
I think we're going to talk about some of the things that all the companies have done next. But let's go to Jennifer. Running an innovation lab, it seems like everyone would want to write on a whiteboard, but maybe they're not next to each other anymore. Jennifer, what was the last year like for you?
Sorry, I think it was one of questioning our own assumptions. So I always had made the assumption, as someone that runs an innovation lab, that innovation happens in real life. We're all together in a room with a whiteboard and sticky notes. And the reality is we couldn't do that. So we really had to ask ourselves, how do we innovate and collaborate using remote tools? Thankfully, Capital One, we had all the tools with us, because my offices are across multiple different cities and we are embedded in the larger Capital One. So every project we do is with another part of the company. So we had those tools, but we hadn't relied on them as like the tools that we do everything with. One of the things that I think was the biggest transformation for us was moving to a remote hackathon model. Hackathons are a really big structure for us to engage the rest of Capital One. And everyone loved being a part of the lab hackathons, because you went to our fancy offices that were really fun, where everyone had snacks and we'd all work together. So we've had to figure out how to bring snacks home to people, but also get people involved in the hackathons in a longer time cycle, because it's not just 3 days in a room anymore. It really is like, how do you get people to know each other before the hackathon, so that way they can get down to working, right? This magic that happens in a room it's really hard to contain, but a lot of it is just like getting to know another person, being with them, eating breakfast and lunch and dinner with them means that you know them better. So when you're coding with them, you can tell them that's wrong, right? And in the virtual world, we had to extend that out over 3 weeks rather than 3 days. And it's proven to be really useful.
Thank you. John, when I think of Dell, I think of a lot of pieces of equipment and hardware and stuff that you actually have to have in your hands. How has it been to try and have a remote workforce, or have you had essential people come in more? What was the last year like at Dell?
Yeah, we're a quite large company with a very large global workforce, but interesting enough, in March when we made the decision to go remote, we had spent 10 years building up our connected workplace capability. So, everybody kind of went home on a Friday, and on Monday they were all remote, and things continued on for the most part. There were little areas that we had to work out, like how does a mechanical engineer work remotely? And so we had to develop all kinds of interesting ways to work in shifts and clean the labs. And those were minor things we worked through. We had some fun logistics because we deliver a lot of equipment out into the real world, all over the world. And we discovered that there were different rules. There were fun things like borders reappeared in Europe that we weren't expecting. But again, we're kind of used to dealing with that stuff. And so things pretty much transitioned very nicely for us. As Miriam said, our customers were a different spectrum. There were customers that were well on their way in digital transformation and kind of behaved like us. They just pivoted. They were great. And then we discovered that there were a lot of IT environments that really hadn't done much digital transformation. They kind of assumed the world was as it was. And we spent a good portion of the first part of last year really doubling down on helping them get into production. Simple things like, do you even have laptops? Do you have a VDI infrastructure? Can you work remotely? So there was a bit of panic, but I think we got through that and largely everything kind of settled down. And then, probably the last thing we discovered was, we cover a very broad technical range, and we kind of planned our year on an expectation that certain technologies would be popular and other ones would be less popular, and that's where our revenue would come from. Everything got turned on its head. For instance, our client business, we kind of expected the PC world to be a little bit more steady state after the big Windows upgrade. And it turned out it wasn't. It turned out to be a massive market. And we've had record quarters all year long because people had to outfit their homes. They realized one PC in the house was not sufficient, or they realized that, going home and working with a 4-year-old laptop that can't even run Zoom is a problem. And then the biggest observation on the client side we saw was that when everybody went home to work, the expectation was everybody's work was identical. And it's kind of the equivalent of saying everybody comes into the office one day, and as you walk in, they hand you a piece of paper and a pencil and say, there's your tools. Doesn't matter if you're a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, an engineer. And over the course of the years, people started realizing that the work from home experience isn't homogenous. It's extremely personalized. And so now we've seen an innovation cycle on monitors and work from home environments and peripherals and AR and VR. And that's pretty exciting, but that would not have happened without COVID. But I think it's a very handy thing as we think about doing this for the long term.
All right, well, let's dig into some of the products and technologies that kind of are changing the workplace and business, maybe, regardless of whether or not there's a pandemic. I wanted to start with Emily because, as Miriam suggested, one of the things that happened during the pandemic was just speeding up the transition to digital workflows. And DocuSign seems right at the center of that. Tell me a little about some of the new technologies that people are moving to. I was fascinated to read about notarization happening virtually. It seems like the opposite of what could happen virtually.
Yeah, absolutely. And to Miriam's point earlier, we've seen with our customers that they have fast-tracked and almost leapfrogged their plans and their strategies to transform into a more digitized world much, much faster because the pandemic's forced that. But the interesting thing about that to me is that I just can't see people going back. Now that this has kind of gained momentum, it's proven that we can progress in a more digitized world. The interesting thing about DocuSign is obviously we've been around for 17, 18 years or so, and most people know us for the e-signature. But DocuSign is much more than the e-signature. We are the agreement cloud. And if you think about that for a moment, it's a way to automate workflow. The world runs and operates on agreements. The signature, it's almost like we started with the end first, with the signature, and have now gone back to the end-to-end contract lifecycle management, whether that be through a new employee who needs to sign an agreement, whether it's legal use cases with contracts, healthcare, life sciences, procurement, you name it. There's so many different use cases for that. So during this time of digital transformation, we've seen that our customers have adopted the DocuSign Agreement Cloud, not just for the e-signature portion, but also to automate that workflow. Workflow is inherently complex, and it's been very manual up until fairly recently. So, having the capabilities to automate through the Agreement Cloud has really exponentially changed the way people work. Now, putting my security and trust hat on for a moment, there's some really inherent security benefits to that too. Because if we all think about the contracts that we negotiate, whether it be on the sell side or a buy side, there are red lines going back and forth with legal, multiple versions, usually getting emailed back and forth of various contracts. In an Agreement Cloud, they don't go anywhere. The annotations happen within a system. So it massively decreases my data footprint for me as an operator, as a security operator, because it's all in one place as well. So the byproduct of something like that for people like me who obviously care very deeply about the trust and the security of the company, just like many of your companies do, that also has kind of a very inherent byproduct. You mentioned the innovation side. We acquired a couple of companies over the last 12 months or so. One of them was Seal Analytics, Seal Software, which is a way to essentially automate an awful lot of the analysis within that Agreement Cloud. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later. And then also you mentioned the remote online notary. Obviously driven very much by a digital need in the world that we find ourselves in. We acquired a company called Liveoak, and when we think about how remote online notaries could operate and change the way that we work, and you think about just buying a house, you have to get something notarized. So many lawyers have notary needs for many, many business functions. So we saw that as an opportunity for us to deepen the experience of that Agreement Cloud and look not just towards agreements, but also the signature and the notarization piece as well.
Jesse, you're not doing anything virtual. It's rubber on the road. But tell me, I can't wait for my robo-taxi to pick me up. But tell me, what are the challenges there? What are the technologies that you're kind of most dug in on to try and bring that self-automated car world to life?
It's an interesting one because nobody's quite done this yet, and it's an amazingly diverse collection of people and technology you need to pull something like this off. I mean, you have the vehicle sort of aspect of it, and we kind of know how to make cars. We've been making cars for a little over 100 years. And some of the ingredients in a robotaxi are very similar to what goes into a car, but the architecture is actually quite different. And you think about safety and redundancy, the powertrain and the vehicle control, and it's actually fairly different. And then where it gets really different is the technology side with the sensing and the computing and the algorithms and the AI, the remote teleoperation capabilities. These are things that haven't really been done before on a product like this. And even the sort of safety assurance on the AI side, we've seen rockets get launched, we've seen medical devices. There's been a little bit of this, but never in the kind of unstructured uncertainty that's present on our city's streets. So it's also sort of an AI challenge of a generation. So trying to put all that together into one product and then release it and say, hey, this is safe. That's quite a task, and it's one that we're all up for, and the industry is working on more broadly. But it's definitely something that is a new way of thinking about a problem for sure.
Miriam, we often think of AI in that context of it's going to drive our car, or it's going to do something, be a robot. But I've heard more and more, read more and more about AI actually kind of coming in the workplace, helping us make decisions, even writing documents. Tell me a little about what are you hearing about AI as sort of a business process?
That's a very hot topic for us. One of the things we've been doing with AI is creating applications, things like being able to sort through many contracts and understand what what all of the conditions and the T's and C's are, and how that we can use AI to see what the trends are across our clients' contracts. Very helpful for procurement organizations And that's, we have a cognitive contract tool that we've built completely with AI embedded. Contact centers, and really embedding AI into the contact centers so that there is a decision points that gets away from your more traditional way of sorting calls and going through the IVR, and really using AI up front in order to make the call a better experience for the end customer, which, by the way, is probably the number 2 or 3 thing that we've seen services that our clients are looking for. Security being number 1 right now. The second one is really around customer experience, and servicing the customer is big. I think that several of my panelists have mentioned it. But one of the other things that we have seen is really using it for COVID tracing and also for vaccination tracing. So I don't know if you've read about, I'm really proud of this one. It's something that we've been doing with Morehouse College. Because what's been interesting about COVID for us and technology is the opportunity that it has brought for us to do things better in general. Yes, it's a pandemic. Yes, it's very sad, the 400,000+ lives we've lost in the US, not to mention globally. However, the sort of silver lining is the ability to, how do we have a more just world by using technology and being able to, like I was mentioning, this application that we've built jointly with Salesforce for Morehouse College, and able to get the vaccine out into minority communities and diverse communities faster. It's a really cool application, has a lot of AI embedded in it. And things like that, I think, are what's going to make the difference. We're not going to go back. We are not going to go back to doing things the old way. And just adding this empathy and this better way of looking at the world into our technical solutions, I think we could all agree has been a bit of a silver lining coming out of the pandemic.
Indeed. Now, Jennifer, I'm sure you could talk about AI and pivot to AI, but I first wanted to ask you about a different topic that's been much in the news, and that is the old digital currency. And we used to talk a lot about blockchain. I'm curious, some of your peers, I think, even made announcements this week. I'm curious, how are you working on things around digital currencies, and do you see uses for blockchain in the sort of core financial companies?
I think what's interesting about the world of digital currencies and blockchain is so many people lump them together as if they're one thing, when the reality is that they really are different things. When I look at the blockchain and think about all of the uses on it, because frankly, it's a ledger, right? So it is a place where there is going to be data. It's going to be held forever. And that opens up a lot of doors for not just financial use cases, frankly, but there's so many companies that are thinking about how do you actually store information in there for the long term based on like where their products are, where their manufacturing chains are. All of that seems really, really powerful. But then the other place that's really powerful is on authentication, right? So like you're having a place where there is concrete information stored and we know it to be true. I think that place is very powerful and is something that we're looking into. And then cryptocurrency, I mean, it is a wild ride we are in right now in the world of cryptocurrencies. It's to some degree, it's hard to keep up with what's going up, what's going down, what's driving the needle for any of these things. Time will tell. We have to play this out because, these are all fairly new things. We think 20 years, that's how long some of these have been around. That's actually not long in the world of currency. So we really have to see what are the use cases. I know some places are now starting to take Bitcoin for purchases. And I think we'll just wait and see on this one.
All right. John, I wanted to come back to your point about this very surprising explosion or revival of the PC and the laptop and everything. We certainly purchased our share in the Pressman household last year to suit everybody up. Tell me a little about how did that then, what people were buying, but so what did you guys do to try and meet new needs, or maybe this camera up here? I don't know. Tell me a little about what's going on with innovation in that space.
Well, the biggest thing that happened was you put in the hands of a whole lot of people who weren't actually using virtual experiences to do their day job or their education. They suddenly had it, and nothing like a very large customer base to tell you what they like and what they don't like. And once you have people using technology for things like virtual learning, you understand where the deficiencies are, and that led to all kinds of interesting things. Like we discovered that camera placement's kind of important. In fact, at CES a month ago, we launched a whole bunch of new monitors, and one of the novel features that no one had never done before is the webcam pops out of the top of the monitor, and then we put a button on some of the monitors to allow you to automatically invoke Teams or Zoom without having to go through the click, click, click. These sound like very simple things, but the reason you can actually start to innovate on them is you now have a large enough user base where you can look at the workflows of how people are behaving and figure out where to best apply technology to improve it in some way. And so, at the end of the day, I think that we're very early on this journey of kind of hyper personalization of the remote experience. We have to get to a point where we actually think about the work from home experience in the context of your job. Today we don't. We apply our job to the work from home experience. Here's your PC, be a journalist. That's not really the best answer. It would be better if we could say, well, what does it take to be a journalist or an engineer or a teacher? What is it about their experience? Do they need a different kind of display interface? Is it better if they, for instance, can work in an augmented reality environment, or if their input devices are different? And all of that is going to spawn a really interesting cycle of innovation. Funny enough, the other thing that we've been working on, we've been doing this for a very long time. We have a project across the whole company called AI In, which is basically using machine intelligence in our entire portfolio to allow them to exceed the potential of their hardware and software. Well, it turns out on the client side, what you start to discover is there's all kinds of suboptimal behaviors of people using technology by themselves. And so we've added things like, some really cool machine learning technology we use on audio streams, which allows them to kind of learn your environment, understand you have a dog or kids or things that make noise, and control the audio streams in a way that actually block those out or adjust the noise cancellation. We have a thing called the precision optimizer that says, hey, let's look at how that engineer is working across their workloads and dynamically adapt the behavior of the computing device to reallocate resources so they're not involved. And so we're seeing this trend of not just personalized experience from an interface perspective, but an awareness of the compute and the systems in your home or that you're interfacing with, knowing what you're doing and trying to work on your behalf. And all that's a huge innovation cycle, which clearly tells you the PC is not dead. There's a lot of innovation that's coming, and we're going to see it. We've already seen it in the market, but I think we'll see it for a very extended period where we progressively get better at surrounding people with technology that works on their behalf and understands their context. It isn't just a PC. It isn't just a monitor. It's something that's tuned to your environment. And that should be a lot of fun.
We're going to go to Andrew with some audience questions in 1 second. But John, I learned some news from you while we were talking before the session came on. A lot of people have probably seen this lawyer who accidentally had a filter of a cat on, and he asked the judge if he could participate in court with his cat filter on. John, what do we know about where the cat filter came from?
Yeah, we're the proud participants. In fact, it turns out that we've been kind of snarky. Michael actually published a tweet. I think he said the future is meow. But anyway, there's a lot of cat jokes going on right now. But really, what it turns out that filter technology was built in, I think, 2010 by Dell and delivered in the early 2010 through 13 period as a feature in a webcam driver. So that was a pretty old machine out there that they were using. The moral to the story, interestingly enough, is that code probably should not be there anymore. Normal patching and upgrade cycles would have long deleted that. It would never have been there. And so there's an interesting example of, as your software technology evolves, keeping up to date can actually avoid some unintended consequences, like being a virtual cat in a court environment. The funny thing is we've been having a bit of a debate about, should we resuscitate it and relaunch it, make it available again? Because it was actually one of the funniest things I have seen in a very long time. And it kind of gave us some great comic relief in a pretty serious time. But yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't seen that video, you should go look for it. All right, I'll turn it over to Andrew, who has questions for the panel from the audience.
Aaron, how can I follow up cats on the internet? It's like, all right. Laura here has a great question around document editing technology. Obviously, with all of us working remotely more intensely than before, we're just dealing with this more regularly. So some of this is like, kind of sequential editing, like, DocuSign's bread and butter. Some of this is group editing, the Google Docs of the world, the Microsoft Office 365s of the world. So this question is a bit for Emily, but actually a little also for Jennifer as it pertains to blockchain authentication and all that. Is there room to improve here, and are you working on it as it pertains to editing documents, the bane of our existence?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And how do you follow cats, by the way? So, Power Forms and the ability to build and create and edit forms has been a huge part of DocuSign's bread and butter for a long time. We continue to innovate in that space because the use cases that we get from our customers are constantly evolving. So there's always going to be an evolution as to how we respond and react to the needs of the customers. The interesting side about kind of how you gain the intelligence on all of the documents that you have within an agreement cloud. I mentioned Seal Analytics that we acquired last year. The interesting thing about that is it allows us to apply the power of AI to all of the documents and agreements that you have within a system. You imagine, companies that have thousands and tens of thousands of agreements, running an analyzer and analytics for simple things like, I'm going to use my my legal friends as an example. If you wanted to understand your limitation of liability across 10, 15, 20,000 contracts, how would you do that manually? You couldn't do that manually. So you have to use and leverage AI to be able to do that. And things like the Seal software has allowed us to do that. Now, the reason I mention that is because I think what we're going to find is as we continue to use AI, we're probably going to automate some of the editing that will come out of that. You want to take the intelligence to certainly analyze and give you good information, but how can you now turn that into something actionable? So I think as we progress and innovate in the future, it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see our customers' use cases wanting to use the output of AI in order to do more sophisticated, automated editing of documents as we progress.
I'll chime in a little bit because Emily, as a consumer of things like DocuSign, I am super excited to hear the innovation happening there. Last year in April, I coincidentally was buying a house, and there were like 3 weeks where all the lawyers were going back and forth because New York State would not allow for any in-person transactions. None of our lawyers had ever done a final closing not in person. We had so many issues in that time, and I think that brings together like two things, which are wherever there are legal documents and contracts, there are often big sums of money, right? So you have this scenario in which these things go distinctly together. And I do think the pandemic is pushing us to figure out a solution for, hey, it no longer needs to be the case that you go in buy something in person. You no longer need to go close on a house in person. You no longer need to be in any vicinity of each other to negotiate contracts and put in all these details. So I do, and I do think the blockchain is going to be a really pivotal part of how we actually document the future of really large financial transactions and the management of assets. And I just wish all of that had been sorted last April when I was trying to close on this house.
I hear you.
Andrew, do you have one more you want to?
I've just got a small one, and it's, of course, Jason's. When will Zoox start offering rides in San Francisco because he lives in the Bay Area?
Good question. Well, as soon as possible. As you can see from our reveal announcement in December, our vehicle is pretty much ready to go, and it actually is driving autonomously, including capable of doing that in San Francisco. What we're working on right now is really those those final nines on the safety. We can drive actually in some ways better than humans already. In fact, when we look at our metrics of our level 3 test vehicles driving in the most challenging parts of San Francisco, they actually make fewer mistakes than humans do. And we've actually measured that and compared it. And they're getting better every couple of weeks. So that's great. But in order to truly remove the driver and launch this as a service, we have to show that not only do they make fewer mistakes, But in those very rare corner cases that could potentially be more dangerous, we're also still significantly better than humans. And that's really what we're working on validating and improving right now. So it's going to be at least a couple years before you can get in one of these things as a commercial service. But we're really optimistic that it's not going to be too much more than that because, we're able to track our progress quantitatively and we sort of know what that human benchmark is. And we're really excited about the progress we're making.
It is. I can't wait till I don't have to pay attention to the wheel anymore. We also, promised in our title of this talk, and I emailed with Miriam a little about this, that, we were also going to look at some ideas that maybe weren't quite working or things we found that didn't fit the way the times changed. Miriam, I'm interested in, all your dealings with your clients. Are you taking away lessons of things to avoid or things that didn't quite work out as we hoped?
Sorry about that. I didn't unmute fast enough. Doing things in a silo. So implementing technology that only impacts one function and doesn't communicate with all its adjacencies is something that I've seen in the most, probably even pre-COVID, but really intensely in COVID. The idea that if you're going to go to an all digital environment in order to get the right business outcomes, you can't do it in isolation has really taken off, right? It's almost that whole idea. We did a CEO survey in the middle of the pandemic last summer, or in the middle of phase 1 of the pandemic, I should say. And I think 79% of the 1,400 CEOs we interviewed said that more so than ever, it was their job to make sure that whatever transpired or whatever transformation happened in their business, in their company, in their enterprise, had to be end-to-end. That whole idea of the horizontal journeys, whether it's the data and being able to have real-time data, that's one version of the truth that we've been talking about forever. And how do you use AI to get to that? Or if it's the employee experience, and how do you make a constant employee experience? What do you implement across that? And really this whole notion of service management across all of those horizontal journeys, if you will, I think has been huge. And so taking away the ideas that you're going to implement an HR solution that only deals with, the HR types of policies and processes, I think that's really, really vectored into, you're going to do an employee experience. Yes, the HR application is going to be part of it, but all these other things that connect the employee experience to the customer experience are going to be additional components of it. So I would say in terms of trend, siloed implementations is really starting to go by the wayside. And we see that particularly in our clients that were already in digital transformation and are accelerating it. And it's giving the opportunity to people who have sort of jumped into it now to start with a fresh start of how do you build that connected enterprise without having to then go back and retrofit it.
Okay. Jennifer, I read a quote of yours that you like to start new ideas, but then I think you said you killed 95% of them. Tell me a little about how you sort out kind of what's working from what's not, or what your priorities are there.
Totally. I think everyone imagines that innovation is like this lightning bolt that strikes you and you're walking down the street and you have a fantastic idea and it just like comes to life. And I just like
in the shower,
yeah. You're like scrubbing your hair and something magical happens. I just not like that. Like, it is the case that you have to be constantly what I call filling your well, like putting creative things in there, coming up with ideas, teasing them out. And that's why we in the lab, we shut down 95% of what we do, because it's not the case that those ideas are bad. They're often great ideas. They're just not great for right now. For any number of reasons, they aren't great. So I always say to my team, we must ruthlessly prioritize. The future is depending on us to do that. So for us in the lab, it's always a question of what are our long-term goals? Because I really do believe innovation is a long-term game. Again, people think it's the lightning bolt, it happens overnight. And it's like, no. Anything I've worked on that's really interesting has taken many years to actually really come to fruition. So as a company, what are your long-term goals and how are you playing into that? Next, how do you make some bets that maybe no one else would make, right? I always think of everything as a portfolio approach. So when I'm thinking about what should stay and what should go, I always ask, in the collection of work I have, which ones are more likely to succeed because they're further along and we've vetted them enough? Which one, where do we have space to play and say, like, even if this thing crashes and burns, it's okay because we've got some other stuff. And then there's always what do you see out in the market that is a fleeting trend that maybe is somewhere in another country in a different context that you think is interesting and has a tie into your customer, right? There's always got to be a tie into your customer, and the customer can be the current customer you have today or a future customer you'd like to have. And you need to reserve space for those explorations of changes in behavior, changes in marketplaces. And that's how I think about my portfolio. But that does unfortunately mean we kill a lot of stuff. Thankfully, we document it all so we can always go back. And that makes it feel less painful. If you know, it can come back in the future if that moment is right.
Very good. I have some ideas I think maybe I'm going to bring back. All right. Andrew has another question for us.
Of course. That's so metal, Jennifer. I just want to just say 95 death all the time. Okay. Miriam is asking the great grand question that I love during a Brainstorm Tech event, which is everything sounds amazing, but. And of course, the but here is how do we get people in less favorable economies or places in the world access to these technologies, to these innovations, to these whatever. And obviously, we're in a weird time right now in world history. If anybody has any grand ideas for how to ensure we pull up the rear, so to speak, would love to hear them.
Well, speaking for Dell, we do business in, I think, 190 countries around the world. And, one thing we learned a long time ago is there's some value in democratizing technology. And democratizing technology is code for make it available for the largest population set you can possibly reach with that technology. Now, not all technology is easily democratized. I'm pretty sure, Jesse will tell you, their self-driving vehicle is pretty specialized and high end right now. But the distant future, or maybe not so distant future, will democratize that technology, but there needs to be an effort behind it. So the first thing, answer Miriam's question, is you have to have a conscious effort to take technology and expand it. You have to drive costs down. You have to figure out ways to apply it. There was a great story many years ago with the ultrasound system. Actually, I think it was General Electric, GE Medical, was thinking of developing ultrasounds for the West, portable ultrasounds. They were too expensive. Then China came to them and said, hey, we need to basically have low-cost ultrasounds out in rural Chinese hospitals, of which there are many. And they figured out how to do that. And it turned out that the real market that they actually opened up was cheap ultrasounds everywhere else, because they actually focused on that. So, a lot of our activities, we're doing a lot of healthcare and wellness technology work in India. We're not doing it just for India, but we've realized that, hey, solving a problem in India solves in a different strata than, solving in New York. But it starts with a conscious effort to realize that your technology is only as valuable as getting it into the hands of people that can use it. And addressing the global market means you got to basically think beyond a specialized area. And that's a corporate culture and an effort and a methodology and a whole bunch of things. But if you don't have that ethos, you're not really going to solve this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the exciting applications or reasons to work on self-driving technology and robotaxis is not just the environmental impact or the economic impact or certainly the safety impact. It's the ability to improve accessibility for large portions of the Earth's population that really don't have good accessibility options today. Now, as John pointed out, the very, very first iteration of this technology is not going to be accessible and affordable to the entire world. There's going to be a ramp. And originally, in the beginning, it's going to cost a little bit more money. The sensors are new, the compute is new, the vehicle technology is new. But even then, the great thing about it is that you get to amortize that cost over people using it all day long. So it's a dramatically better use of resources environmentally and economically than selling cars to individual people. And when you compare it to ride sharing like Uber, Lyft, or Didi, that's also not very accessible to most people because you're literally having to pay somebody else to drive you around, which is a pretty extravagant thing to do if you think about it, especially as a primary means of commuting. So in the next, couple of years, it's not going to be tremendously transformative. But if you look at the next 1 to 2 decades, you're going to see entire populations that previously had difficulty even getting to work have all kinds of new opportunities that they didn't used to have. And we're really excited about that.
It is one of those things where, you know, the 1 year change, we overestimate and we underestimate the change over a decade or two. And I'm sure that's one of those. I had another question for Emily, for ripped from the headlines, Emily. Solar winds. We have seen some of the worst security breaches in the history of business and government. I'm curious, what kinds of innovations do you think, or new technologies can we apply in the security area to hopefully make us more secure over the next decade?
Yeah, this was such an interesting one because of the methods by which it seemed like a very sophisticated, targeted attack, but used some very basic features of security or lack thereof in order to gain access to multiple organizations, the governments, and what have you. The real polarizing part of the SolarWinds attack to me was just the emphasis on how much we all truly need to understand our ecosystem. Every company is an ecosystem now. We no longer are within our own boundaries. We all rely so heavily on our supply chain, on our third parties. And whilst I think the concept of third-party risk has been around for quite some time, it's been somewhat academic, in my opinion, and it needs to pivot from being somewhat academic to being extremely technical. When you're an organization with an ecosystem that spreads into the tens of thousands sometimes of vendors and suppliers that you have, it's really critical that we understand the technical footprint. It's not just about data flows anymore. We've progressed from being within our own boundaries to being third parties with a, like I say, somewhat academic view, to perhaps now looking at data and how we move data around for privacy concerns, and that's also super important. But I think there's an extra element now that's really doubling down on this concept of trust, which is, to me, really understanding that's a relationship. Trust is a relationship. It is a relationship. Security is a part of that. But I think it really stems to the fact that we all, not just security professionals, because it's embedded absolutely in every aspect of business, we have to truly understand our ecosystem and the supply chain. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in the security world around that as we see things like SolarWinds happening. It just really emphasizes and polarizes the fact that we are no longer standalone companies, that the connected tissue and the fabric that we have with each other, it goes beyond means. And we take that very seriously from a DocuSign perspective, because we're part of lots of other people's supply chain. So having that kind of very trust bone at the very core of what we do, we like to think that we have incredibly high standards. We are incredibly transparent with our customers, because customers deserve to know how we do security. And so I think this is going to be a continued theme as we see things like SolarWinds happening. Customers deserve to know how other people are securing and managing their data. And, we're getting questions now, not just on third parties, but on fourth parties as well. So, where do you stop in that? I see the pendulum continuing to swing that way, and I don't see it stopping anytime soon.
Jennifer, there's unfortunately another kind of security that's been in the headlines this year. I myself someone filed for unemployment insurance under the pandemic relief program with my identity. Are you also, as part of your brief, to identify new technologies and new ways to secure our personal finances?
Yeah, the lab has this really interesting mandate. We do consumer-facing innovation, but then also internal infrastructure and tooling that supports our technologists across Capital One to do work. So it's privacy, identities, fraud. These are really big topics in the lab. We have multi-year programs on these things because things that we have learned. We always joke that says, at Capital One, we have an innovation lab. We're really proud of it. We work really hard. We have this fraud and identity space. There is a fraudster out there that has built a whole innovation lab with really smart people trying to game the system and figure out how do they get access to customers' data. We listen to the phone calls of our customers calling in when they've had issues. We are scouring the internet to figure out what this looks like. It's such a massive space, and we work really hard to stay one step ahead of fraudsters. But I really do believe that there are innovation labs just in fraud to take people's information and take their money. And we've done a lot around trying to educate our customers on what happens outside of the walls of us, because that's the reality, right? Like, they get to your money by going through other merchants, by calling, saying that, I think you bought this thing, but we need to verify your credit card information. Might you give that to us? And those are all the systems at play. And it is so much bigger than just the ecosystem that we run. So yeah, this is a many-year journey that we're on. And again, it's not just products that we're building and infrastructure we're building to protect our data. It is also trying to figure out, how do we protect the data of our customers outside of what they're doing specifically with us, because that is such a big gap in this system.
It's interesting. So out there on the dark web is the dark lab.
We joke about it. We think like that they must have their hackathon this week too, because like we monitor all of this action, and we suss out like tiny things that have happened, and it's all test and learn. That's the other fascinating part, is that is how fraud works. It is a complete test and learn infrastructure, and we just have to be ahead of it.
Miriam, I'm curious, because there's a bit of a trade-off, right, between whether people want to digitize versus how scared they are maybe about the security. Has that equation been changing among your clients?
I think so. I think this whole topic of trust that Emily brought up is so in focus right now, and resiliency, because of what we saw transpire, right? So the idea, though, is to start with that security up front. So rather than thinking of it as an afterthought in your digital, whatever applications or whatever transformation you're doing, really start to embed it with risk mitigation strategies from the beginning, so that you can try to mitigate and manage losing trust with your stakeholders. I think that's a very different mindset. How do you embed it from the beginning? How do you manage it? And how do you optimize it? Rather than thinking about it as an add-on. Oh, we have to worry about cyber risk, or we have to worry about reputational risk, or we have to worry, really building it into the overall design and from the very beginning. That's what we're seeing is a much more active trend, and really looking at what those safe digital spaces are as a must-do going forward, rather than as an afterthought.
All right, we're almost out of time, but John, I also want to get your feedback on this security issue. What's it look like at Dell there for innovation on security?
Yeah, I think we live in two worlds. In the physical layer, physical supply chain security, we feel reasonably good about. That's an area we focus tremendously on. I mean, I can literally produce, for instance, a server in a factory, digitally sign every component on it, and validate when it goes into production in a bank on the other side of the world through the supply chain that everything in that was exactly what was produced. That's a pretty sophisticated system that, funny enough, we only did that for governments years ago. Now it's quite popular with a lot of people because there's risk there. It's the software supply chain that's the problem. And this is where SolarWinds exposed weakness. It was in the build system. It was not where we expected security technology to necessarily live. There were lots of flaws and errors, but it exposed problems. The good news is we're thinking about it as an industry. For instance, there's an initiative going on right now called the software bill of materials. Should you, when you consume software, have an understanding of its provenance, what's inside of it, who created it. But we actually think you need to go further, because it's not just the software itself and who created it, it's how they created it. We were a kind of pioneer in something called Extreme Agile with one of our entities called Pivotal Labs. It turns out that if I have developers developing code using Extreme Agile and paired programming, I am really comfortable that code has high integrity, because they're QAing it as they're writing it. The pairs are rotating. It's a very, very robust methodology. Now, I would never do that for a lot of code, but certain places that's pretty valuable. There are other areas where it might be an AI or a machine that's creating that code, and knowing about that and knowing how to ascribe, I think Miriam or Emily said, trust to these things is critical. But right now, we feel pretty good about the physical supply chain. It's never perfect, but there's been a lot of work there. It's the software supply chain and rethinking how software is delivered, how we understand its provenance, and how we ascribe trust to it, which is really going to be the action for definitely the next 4 or 5 years to get up to speed and be equivalent to the physical supply chain.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think all of you have given us a lot to think about today. We're going to wrap up there. Huge thanks to Emily, Miriam, Jesse, Jennifer, and John for joining us today. And I'll give it back to Andrew.
Yes, thank you to all of our speakers today and to our corporate partners, 3 Pillar Global and KPMG. We hope to see you at our next virtual event, and we really hope to see you in person at perhaps our innovation lab in Half Moon Bay, California, November 30th and December 1st. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you again soon. Thanks for joining.